I've been doing pretty much all my text in After Effects for, I don't know, a lot of years now. I was never very happy with the text options in any editing software that I used. I just sort of always wanted it to be easier and more intuitive than it was, and more precise than it was, and all that. So I've gotten to the point where I really only do placeholder things in Premiere, just because it makes more sense for me to do it in here. And 99.9% of my projects are going to end up in After Effects anyway, so that's my workflow. There are certainly good things that you can do with text in Final Cut and Premiere and whatever other editor you might be using, but this is where I like to be, because it's super powerful, and it is intimidating, but it doesn't have to be, and that's a big part of what I'm going to work through tonight. So I'm going to try to cover a little bit of the basics here for the people who've never touched it. I'm going to try not to go too crazy on them, but I want to make sure that everyone's along for the ride before I do anything more advanced. So I'm not really going to get into any like design principles of text and fonts and all that stuff, because that's a whole other semester's worth of stuff, honestly. So I'm more just going to show you how how the animators in here work, and yeah. So let's see. Obviously, there's a ton of stuff that you can do with text in After Effects. I just brought along a couple samples of stuff that I've done, and helpfully, Windows Media Player doesn't scrub. That's really sweet. I like that. Okay, so this is a great example. This is just sort of a kind of an illustrated type explainer video. And this is a good example of something that is real easy to do with a lot of the text animators in here. And kind of watch some of the stuff that happens here. A lot of type on and then kind of a random type off. This video has a lot of like text moving on in blocks and swinging on and stuff like that. And that's really just using text as objects like you would any other layer. So, but you can use stuff like that in combination with text animators to make really cool stuff. Let's see. When you combine text animators with the 3D features that a couple newer versions of After Effects have, you can pretty easily make some pretty cool stuff. And let's see. This would be a good one. This is a good example of a lot of text stuff that, like, this uses so many text animators through a lot of this stuff. Things that would be basically impossible to do in something else. Just there's so many little randomness things and all kinds of numbers and stats going on. Just kind of wanted to show a couple ideas of things that you can do with this. Maybe we'll come back if there's a good spot later. So I guess to start out here, and if at any point I hit something that you're confused about, just feel free to stop me. I'm going to kind of try to get as much screen real estate as I can here. I'm going to have to work in sort of a weird layout. Yeah, because as soon as you start animating text, for example, if you add one character, you can potentially have all of this stuff open. You don't usually need to, but obviously you need a lot of vertical real estate to really be able to see what you're doing potentially. So get rid of this because it's in Comic Sans and it's dumb. I think the thing about text animation is that probably like 95% of the time, I honestly just use the same couple tricks anyway, because subtlety is good. Like, generally what you're looking to achieve is just, you want to give it enough life to do something, and so it doesn't just look like you faded it on. But you know, if you have crazy things flying around all over the place, then that calls attention to itself. It's just like when you're editing. I mean, how often do you use anything besides a crossfade or just a straight cut? Maybe a wipe every once in a while. You're not using the paw print wipe in every video you do because, but the one time that you need the paw print wipe, you're really happy that it exists. And that's the case with a lot of these text animators too. They certainly have their place, but there's a lot of them that are very kind of special case. There we go. So, just in case you weren't aware, you can browse presets, and for text especially, this is a really great place to come and see what your options are. So all you have to do is have a text layer created, which it's just like creating text anywhere else. You've got a little text tool here where you can hit Control-T. Oh good, Comic Sans is back, yes. We're gonna work in Comic Sans for a while here. I feel like that color is just not appropriate though, maybe something more like that. So once you have a text layer created, you can just go Animation, Browse Presets, and then that'll take you over into Bridge. And I want those to be, okay. So they list this out by categories, and again, most of these are going to be kind of goofy ones that you're not going to use all that often, but it's a good way to come in here and see what exists and see what your options are, and maybe you like a little piece of what they're doing, and so you can just apply it in here and get rid of the bits you don't want, tweak it, and that way you don't have to start from scratch. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel every time if you don't need to. So maybe you're doing a typewriter type effect or something like that, which is pretty common. You can just come in here and find one, and when you click on it, it shows you a little preview over here, and you can cruise through here and see all kinds of stuff. Some of them are useful, you know, something like this you can certainly see a use for. It's not every day, but something like this, probably a little more special case, you know.
If I can interrupt for a second.
You may
The
know.
version before they did that, I rendered out every one of them. I took text and I said, all right, I want to just be able to see all these. So I made like 300 little tiny 6-second videos, and then I kid you not, it wasn't a month later, the version they did out. I was so mad.
One thing that this is really great for is when you do have special case stuff, a lot of these, like the work's kind of already done for you, because if this is relevant to what you're doing, making this manually kind of sucks. So, I mean, if I wanted to do something similar to this, I would come in here and do that, and then just go from there. Really no reason to build it from scratch if it already exists, because you're kind of just wasting your time. There's lots of good stuff in here. A lot of them are kind of weird and silly. And, I'm trying to look for. I like this one. I have used this one before, a couple times actually, in the right context. Anyway, so all you have to do is you've got your text layer selected in here, which you did when you went to browse preset anyway. So when you found one that you like, you just double click on it, and it has now applied it here. See how it opened up and it added some animators. I'm going to go ahead and kill those. I just kind of want to show you, in case you didn't know that existed, that's a really easy way to add stuff, and one of the best ways to figure out all of these is just to play with it and kind of see what all of them do. So I'm going to kill that, and I'm going to close bridge because I don't need it. So you've got a text layer, and you want it to do stuff. So you can open it up, and you'll see some of these little things here. And let's say we just want to do kind of a basic animate on. We want to bring on, have it kind of fade on across the word instead of all up at once, because it makes it a little more interesting that way. So what you do is you come to this little arrow right here and click animate, and then there's all your properties right here that you can animate. So I'm going to choose scale because it's probably the best one to help show as an example of what's happening when you're dealing with the selectors and stuff.
So before you click on that animate thing, if you've never really understood that, the way I like to think of it is like when you have to do an effect and you're just doing one on nothing, what do? You create a solid, right? That's kind of what we're going to apply things to. Is that kind of, would you call that a similar type thing? Like this is the solid that we're going to start, going to put animation things on.
Yeah, just like when you have a solid, and I'll make it a small one so that it's kind of easy to see. When you have a solid or any other object in here, you've got all your various transform properties and stuff. And this is the same stuff, it's just per character, or per word, or per line, however you want it to work. Because obviously the only other way to do that would be to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, however many layers of each letter to do that, and that sucks. So being able to have this power to animate per character in here is really, really powerful when that's what you need to do. Looking at my notes here, I did want to come back to one thing real quick before I start animating, and that's that if you're familiar with doing text in Illustrator and Photoshop, it really works the same way. You can always just kind of select things. You can change fonts like within words. You can change colors within words and stuff like that. So just because it's one sort of object here, it can be whatever you want within here. And just like in there, you can use the Alt and arrow keys to change your kerning and all that stuff. Is there anyone who isn't familiar with what these various tools do down here? Okay, good. I won't spend any more time on that. The only things that I think might be different, stroke has its own little thing here. Stroke is. Stroke has its own little thing here, so you can crank it up like that, and then you can set the strokes so that you can determine how they fill in. I think Illustrator has that same thing. Yeah. Because this is certainly relevant, especially like as you're animating stuff, you may not really think about it being necessary. Sometimes fill over stroke might work fine, but then you realize as you bring your letters together, they're actually overlapping in there like that. Maybe that's what you want, maybe it's not. So just be mindful that you have various options down here that you can tweak like that. And all your little like all caps, small caps, superscript, italic, faux italic, faux bold, all that stuff is just down here. So should all be pretty familiar. How about we use a font that isn't so obnoxious? This one. Just go back to something simple here. Okay, so
there's a question.
Yes.
Just real quick, and excuse me if I just got it totally wrong. Is there, can you, say like kerning, can you keyframe that to go from
sort of
A to B?
You can animate the tracking,
Or is that
so you can
a different
animate
thing?
like the full-on
Yeah,
like that.
yeah.
And if you wanted to do like
So that's
individual-
separate from the kerning?
Yes.
Okay, that's
Kerning would be sort of in addition to that. I
It's
guess
just
maybe be the best way to say it.
one-time setting.
Yeah, and technically you could animate, like if you wanted to have specific things like this, and if you wanted that gap to change over time like that, there are ways that you could do that. Kerning wouldn't really be the right approach at that point. You'd probably want to think about it in a little different way, and you'd actually want to like set a range selector on this second half and use a position animation on that or something. It might be easier to split it into two different layers at that point and just use the position. If that makes sense, yeah. Get rid of all of those. And I have a comment about something like that written later in my notes, but there's a lot of times when it might be easier to just do something by just making a second copy and doing this. And so if you wanted them to move on from two different directions or something like that, there's nothing wrong with that. There's a lot of times when that's the right answer. Because rather than getting super complicated and making 5 different little animators with on one layer of text so that you can have stuff move on all these crazy ways, just break it up into different layers if that's the easier way to go. But there are plenty of times when it's not. So yeah, knowing your options is good. Okay, so where was I? Let me kill this. Okay, so we want to do an animate on, and I guess I'm going to do a scale up thing so that just so you can see what's happening here. And you won't necessarily need to open all this up every time. I just wanted to show you what's going on. So what I'm going to do is play with this scale down here. When I created this animator, I picked scale. See how it creates a little scale value right here? And that's separate from the actual transform, like the layer transform values. So what that's doing, as you can see, is it's changing per character what those are doing. And if you look closely here, can you see the little red X's on there? Those are the anchor points for each layer. And you can change those if you so desire. You can either, there you go, maybe that's an easier way to see them. Are they showing up pretty well on there? Yeah. You can tweak them up here under the more options thing, if you so desire. Or you can also animate the anchor point, which would be per character, and so you can change it like that. That can get complicated pretty quickly if you're not careful, but and you can change how the anchor point grouping works and stuff. I usually leave it per character unless you're trying to do something fancy, which we're not yet. So for the sake of visibility, I'm going to start these at 20 instead of 0. And every time you create an animator, it's gonna by default give you a range selector. And so you've got the start value at 0 here. And as I crank this towards 100, see how there's this little red line kind of bringing things across. And that's showing us the range that is on, or that is animated to back to the previous value. And if you see here at the end, there's also a little thing. So you could, if you wanted to, you can use this range selector to only select certain chunks of the thing. You can use it to bring the whole thing on, the whole thing off, or you can just select a chunk and then you can offset that section. So once you kind of learn to think in those terms, there's a lot of stuff that you can do. Okay. So in this advanced tab, then we have a lot of different ways that we can alter how that works when we so desire. I usually find that working with this as a percentage is easiest when you're doing words, but sometimes if you're doing, maybe you're trying to time out lyrics to a beat or something like that, and you want things to come on by word, then a lot of times it's much easier to, instead of percentage, work by index. And then you see this actually works by a number. So if I want 9 letters to be up, just put 9. And that way you don't have to kind of do that weird reverse math and figure out percentages and stuff. It can be a much more precise way of working if that's what you're after. And here is where you can change what's animating on. So if I have, back to, so now I've got 2 lines of text and 4 words. So if I wanted this to be animating on, oops, let's go back to my percentage here. Okay, so imagine that these are down at 0, and maybe this is what I want. Maybe it's not. Maybe I want each word to come on by itself. So instead of characters, I could set this to words. And then VideoCore is so great. Maybe I want it to be lines. So then VideoCore is so great. You know, it's options, and that's part of why it's intimidating, is because there's so many things to change, and sometimes it can be difficult to kind of figure out what you need to tweak to get achieve what you're looking for. But ultimately, it's a lot of it is the same kind of things that you'll find everywhere else. You just kind of have to understand how it thinks. Let's see. Okay, so you can change the mode that this is working in. Generally, it always defaults to add. You can choose subtract if you want, like if you want it to be kind of working backwards, or you can use this just if you want the reverse of the add, you can set it to subtract. Honestly, I don't think I've ever used these other 4 modes. Feel free to play with them, but I've never really found it too necessary. The amount is you can tweak it so that it kind of affects the amount of the
Animation.
Yeah, I don't know what we're looking for. Property. I don't really mess with this too much. Basically, I would just set it down here if I really wanted to mess with it. But I already had it set. I didn't want to mess with it. Okay. Shape is one of the things that I do tweak a lot. So you can see right here, the way this one's working is each character goes from 20% all the way up to 100, and then it moves on to the next one. And that's okay, I guess, but it kind of creates like kind of, well, I guess it'd be good if I actually animated this before I tried to do a game preview, huh? So it doesn't create the smoothest animation. It's okay if that's what you're going for. And plenty of times you are, but I generally like a smoother transition. So generally what I will do is, instead of square, what this is basically the shape of how that range is moving through this. I'm a big fan of ramp up, because then what you're doing, you can see here, it's actually smoothly coming on. The only thing is, when you do that, you have to think about it a little differently, and you actually want to animate your offset instead of your start. So you see how that comes on a lot more smoothly, and especially when I'm, doing like an opacity on, I much prefer something like this to like feels so kind of typewritery and cold and mechanical when you do that. So it just depends on what kind of effect you're looking for. Smooth works well for a lot of things too. It's kind of a similar effect. It kind of depends on what you're going for. You see how it's actually probably easier to see when you just have one line of text. It's actually keeping it all the way at 100, except for the range that we have in there. So this might be a good time to use subtract, for example, and you kind of move this back and forth if you want to do word dance or something. You just kind of start seeing how a lot of times just a couple little options can make a really big difference in what's possible for what you're doing, and it just depends on what application you're trying to fill with this text. If it needs to be just kind of flat and readable and maybe come on in an interesting way, you're going to deal with that very differently than if you wanted to, whatever. Okay, so, so the ease high and ease low, those kind of help smooth out the animation. Let me set this back to, yeah, this will be a good way to showcase this. So, I've got back to my kind of, oops, what did I do? Caps lock. Not sure how that happened. Let's back to that. Okay, so I've got my, back to my kind of basic thing here. Boring. So ease high and ease low kind of smooth out. It's a lot like using the easy ease keyframes when you're animating something else. They help smooth out how this movement happens. And ease high, you can see, kind of pops on like that, whereas ease low does the opposite. See that difference? So just depends on what you're after, and you can set these to negative values too if you so desire, which would basically do the same as setting the opposite one to 100. There are times when it's relevant to have that though, I'm sure. I don't know if I've thought of one, but it exists for a reason. And randomized order, which is super helpful if you need it, because maybe that's what you want instead. And there are a lot of times when that's very helpful. And then, as with anything that uses randomization, it's not technically random, it's just using algorithms to create randomness so you can set a random seed. So if you had the same word, you know, if you had a couple different copies of this word or something, you didn't want them to, caps lock, you didn't want them to both animate on the same way, you just changed the random seed on one of them, and now that randomness will be different across the two words. And you could, if you had hundreds of variations of this, you could set each one to its own random seed so that none of them are the same. I'm sure you totally are going to take the time to do that. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of the range selector, and honestly, those mechanics that I showed you right there are what you're going to use 98% of the time. So let's do an animator that I would probably actually use for this. Personally, I generally throw on an opacity, and here's a good distinction to make. So I created this animator. If I want to add more properties to this animator so that they use the same set of selectors and keyframes and stuff, then I want to add that next property right here. Whereas if I add it here, it's going to create a second animator. And see how it now has its own range selector and all that business. So that's an important distinction. If you want to animate opacity and position and blur all with the same set of keyframes here, which I do in this instance, then you'll want to make sure you put them all on the same animator here. Because otherwise you're going to have 3 sets of keyframes, and maybe you want them all offset a little bit. That could be an interesting effect too. But just be aware that those options exist. So, oops.
What animator did you put on? What animator did you put on?
I put on a little bit of a position move, just a little bit of a horizontal one here. I put the opacity to 0, and then I've set blur to 50. This is a formula I use a lot. Sometimes I'll not put the position on there, but if you're just looking for something to come up fairly subtly, this is a great little recipe. Maybe a little less on that. And this would be one where I'll, instead of using the square, I'll use the ramp up, and then I'll animate the offset property to bring this on. So it comes on kind of nice and smooth like that. Of course, you can see with the position move, you kind of get this little kind of like as they line up, which I don't particularly like. And that's when you would screw around with like the ease high and ease low so they come in more smoothly like that. Like I said, this is a recipe that I use a lot, and this would be a good instance to, if it's something that you feel like you use a lot, you can just select that animator, save yourself an animation preset.
Tile smoke magic.
Yeah. And now, you know, save. Okay. Well, I don't have permissions to save in that. Okay, whatever.
Wow.
You get the point. Yeah. And so, if I know that's something I'm going to use a lot, now I don't have to make it from scratch every time. I'll just put that text, apply that animation preset that I just created, or right up in here, and now it's done. And what it'll do is create, much like when I applied the other one from Bridge before, that's doing the same thing, it's just applying animation presets. Wherever your cursor is at the time is where it will create the first keyframe. You know, you're free to drag the keyframes however you like and retime it and all that stuff. So personally, like I said, this is a thing I use a lot, and it works pretty well in reverse too. So let's say we want this to come on and then come back off. So I'm just going to duplicate this animator and scooch these keyframes down a bit. Well, obviously this isn't what we want, so this might be a good time to maybe use that subtract property I talked about.
So just real quick, there was a jump, it seemed like. So you
Yeah, there
wrote out
probably
your
is.
text and you created an animator that shows all the properties of what you can do with just this, what was it, fade on or scale on?
Mhm.
Scale. And so all those properties for scale can be applied to every one of those: fast blur, position, opacity. And then all you did was just say, okay, I want to take all of these and do it to all of them at the same time.
Yeah.
It was like nesting.
Yeah, kind of.
text.
So let's say that I really like what's going on here, but like I want the blur to happen just a little bit later. So I could make this from scratch, or I could just duplicate this and where's my mouse?
Just right click.
There we go. Maybe. And me being the person that I am, this would be the time that I would probably start labeling things. That's supposed to be position. Yeah, close enough. Hope City and Hawaii. And then I'm just gonna take this blur property back off. No, there it goes. And then I'm gonna kill position opacity down here. So now, right now, since I haven't moved the keyframes, this is really gonna look the same. But now if I move these keyframes over, keep hitting caps lock when I move to hit shift. Now you'll see, take caps lock off, that blur is gonna clear up a little bit later. And so it just depends on the look that you're going for.
Just one more little point to add on.
Yeah.
When you created that preset, that preset's still there. So this is like, to me, if I was saving a copy of an image I'm editing, now I want to screw with it. I might mess it up beyond the point of breaking it, or beyond to the point of breaking it. Then I might save what I like, and then A, screw with it. If I make something cooler, I'll make another preset. If I break it, I know I can go back. So
Yeah.
I mean, it's a good tool to experiment with.
True. And the other thing I really like about text animators is, you know, maybe I said, oh, I don't want the blur. We just kill it. I mean, since you're just dealing with keyframes on a range selector, you could add and subtract as many properties as you want to this. Maybe this is what you want, you know? And you're like, oh, well, now that they're scaling, they probably need that blur again. So you can just put it back on. It's not a big deal. And you don't have to keep working with new keyframes and stuff. You're just adding the property that you want it to come from, basically. So I think it makes it really easy to experiment because you can just kind of add stuff on and tweak and see how it works. Does this function feel good for everybody? Anybody lost? Okay, great. So I'm going to keep this super sweet animation for the time being. So you probably noticed up here, in addition to all the normal transform properties, and rotation obviously works per character, so you can do all kinds of nutty stuff with that too. You might notice that there's things like fill color, which is a great one to do. Actually, I'm going to add that onto this one just to kind of make it easier. You know, maybe as that's coming on, I want it to go from that to the color that I had picked. So you'll see it's starting blue, and now it's going red as it does all those other animations. And you can mess with the line spacing, the line anchor. Character offset is one I really like. I usually use that as its own thing. But if you're looking for like kind of a glitchy look, character offset is where it's at, man. The thing about this, you really have to be conscious of your font and how it works and what character it's using and stuff, because the alignment will get very wonky very quickly depending on what you're using. I really like this for numbers and for fonts that you either have stretched out far enough that they're not going to be touching each other and it won't make a big difference anyway, or fonts that are monospaced, so that they don't have that problem anyway. But this is a great thing to use if you want that kind of glitch look, and sometimes you can use it just a little bit. You might have caught it in here. The whole point is kind of causes errors, so I think I probably did that one manually actually. Yes, because you can also animate your source text. So over time, you can change what word or words or characters or whatever are actually showing up. Yeah. Who can tell me what this little square keyframe means?
Awesome.
Hey. Somebody, anybody?
Hold keyframe.
Yeah, hold keyframe. Great. Instead of being the little diamonds that animate smoothly in between them, this is just a hold keyframe. But if you want things to just pop on, this is a great way to do it. If you, I don't really need that one. If you are wanting to, oh, I do, because I should be at the beginning. Say you want to just like kind of pop on words to a song or something like that. And I'll show you a little thing that kind of goes more in depth in this later. But rather than having to have a new layer for each thing, you can just animate the source text and have it work like that. And now you can move each word around easily. You don't have to play with the in and out points of different layers and all that stuff. It gets messy. The only caveat here is you decide, oh, you know, I kind of want to change the font. If you had this in all the different text layers, you could just highlight all of them, change the font, and maybe make your little adjustments. But since you've animated the source text, those changes are part of that source text. So you'd have to go through and change each keyframe now. So something to keep in mind. Again, like kind of an option of which way you want to approach it.
Source text and properties.
Yeah. The other cool thing about being able to animate that source text is that, seriously with caps lock key, as with pretty much anything in here, if you can animate it, you can create an expression. So now, oh, did the wrong one. Anything I want to update that to will be reflected in anything that's linked to it. And that may not seem super relevant now, but if you are, for example, doing something like this, I just made this kind of quickie little comp where I'm just using this as a mat for this text, so you can see it's kind of grungy and degraded here. Do you have other batteries for this? I feel like that's an issue here. There's another one.
I'll swap out.
Let's say that you really like this look, but you decide it's not readable enough on the background that you have. So So you might want to make a second copy that could be okay. So the thing about using something with a mat like this is if I put a stroke on the text, then that's, oh, I'm thinking backwards. Let me set this up for the way that I'm actually talking to you. Shh. So a lot of times what you might want to do is you've got your text here, and you want to see something else through the text. So you set that up as your mat. And then you decide that's not really readable enough with what you've got. So the problem is if you just use a stroke on the text, that's changing your mat. And so the better solution might be to create a duplicate copy of that text and then put the stroke on that. I've got some other stuff going on here that's kind of screwing this up. Let me kill that. So you see now I have this second copy that I can put the stroke on, but still keep my sweet grunge effect there. And if this were something where you anticipated words changing a lot, this would be a great time to link up that source text. And if you don't know what I'm doing, I'm hitting Alt when I click that stopwatch. That's how you create an expression, and I'm just pick whipping up here. I don't know what you're yelling at me for. I might have been a little freewheeling with my pick whip. And so now, as I change this word, or chanage this word, it will update. There is one serious caveat to this, and it's that when you make changes to things like kerning, that does not update, unfortunately. I really wish that it did. There might be some good reason why it doesn't. I don't know what it is. But especially if you end up getting stuck with a font that has crappy spacing and you do a lot of this, you will really wish. I mean, the solution is just to, copy paste it like this, and then you can. But then you have to put your stroke back on because the stroke doesn't exist on one that you copy pasted and blah blah blah. Kill my, shouldn't age. But I use this a lot for when there are a lot of, anytime you want to do kind of a slightly more complex text look, this is a good way to keep things linked up so you don't have to keep updating multiple text layers and stuff like that, because that can get old pretty fast.
Is it only on the kerning, or is there any other?
I think that's the only thing. It should take any other changes, fonts and stuff. Oh, hang on. It's still holding on to that original font too. So there you go. Which is strange because then when you animate source text, font goes with it, but this doesn't. I might ask them about that.
Yeah.
For those of you who missed my presentation in the last fall, the Adobe After Effects team really does care about your feedback. So if you ever have a question, you're like, why the hell does this work this way? Just ask them. And a lot of times they'll respond, unless, you probably do it nicely, more diplomatically. But, they do pay attention to your requests, and especially now that they've gone Creative Cloud, it kind of frees them to work on things that make people happy instead of things that move boxes of software. Okay, so let's see. What time do I need to be done with this?
I think we're here till 8:30.
Okay.
Is that right? Okay, so what is it now? 7:30?
7:15. 7:22. Let's see what I want to do here. Okay, so I already kind of showed you going animating on and then back off with the same thing, and obviously that works with any other property too. You can start getting really complex with this pretty quickly if you wanted to. Gosh. Kind of trying to just do something off the cuff, but it's just going to look rough and stupid, I think. I mean, you could get really complicated.
You did the thing where you rotated characters. In CS6, I think it was, they allowed you to rotate the Z space as well.
Like what I highlighted right here?
That thing right
Yeah,
there.
yeah. This is a very important little box. Enable per character 3D. So obviously, 3D layers means that it opens up this extra dimension. You have Z space that you can move in. You can rotate things on the X, Y, Z axes. You can do that per character as well. So when you enable per character 3D, now you'll see that I have a Z position that I can animate the characters in. So they're actually animating like that. And then you can also rotate in various dimensions as well. So, you know, if that's what you want. But you'll see how I made this a second animator, and I haven't set any kind of range selector on here. So I'm just controlling the characters like that. And I'm not animating them per se, I'm just changing how they sit. And sometimes that's totally what you want to do. I was going somewhere else, and I'm gonna change where I was going here. So I've got the per character 3D animated here, and I'm just gonna put a range selector on here. Let's say you don't want to bring things on and off, but you just want to give stuff a little bit of life. Especially like if you're doing a more something that's kind of funky or maybe kid-oriented or something like that. A lot of times giving your text some life so that it's not just sitting there is a really great way to keep things fresh. So instead of this range selector, not instead, but in addition, you can get selectors here. There's a couple. I'm not going to talk about expression selectors tonight because I don't think that into. But you can add what's called a wiggly selector. And a lot of those presets in Bridge rely on this. And I just need to, I'll just change these values a bit. So without even adding any keyframes, see what this is doing here. I just set 5 degrees in all 3 axes here. And then when you add this wiggly selector, it defaults to wiggling between 100% and minus 100% of the value that you set this many times per second. And then a lot of this other stuff is kind of similar. You can choose it to be based on words, or you can set how it interacts, all this stuff. So maybe we want this to be some really crazy text like that. Maybe you had like a TV spot for a kid's thing that you were making. Obviously, that's a lot more interesting and appropriate than just blocks of text that just sit there and don't do anything. You could, instead of rotation, you could certainly be doing this with some opacity. Going like that. And this is also a good place to work in some of the character offset. And again, you have to be careful with a lot of things, but this is when you want the correlation pretty high, I think. You get kind of just like a barely glitchy look or something like that. You could also use the range selector to select only a short percentage of it that's going to be affected. And this is where a static range selector becomes very powerful. Maybe you have a whole sentence and you just want one word to glitch out or something. Just set your range selector to that word, set your wiggly selector, and it'll work like this. Does that all make sense? Cool. Let's see. Okay. Kill all this. Another thing, in addition to that, just kind of smooth wipe on, another thing I use a lot. If you've got something where some text has to come up and it just is kind of sitting there for a long time, it needs to be on screen for a long time, but you're like, man, that's so freaking boring. A great thing that I like to do a lot is just animate the tracking. And this, you don't really animate the range selector, you actually animate the tracking itself. So maybe this is going to be up on screen for like 15 seconds or something like that. And so it might be, I'll do a little bit more just so it's visible. This would be a good instance to do something like this. And this is happening maybe a little faster than it would, but even just something like that, it's pretty subtle, but it's a good way to just keep it moving, give it some life, give it some interest, so it's not just sitting there static. And as long as it's used sparingly, that'll help add some production value. And I'm sure we've all seen these beautifully shot videos, and then you get to the end credits, and it's like, opacity on with my title, and I don't know, just like, text is one of those things that, kind of like audio, like a lot of people don't think about how important it is, but it's really easy to see when someone didn't take the time to do it right.
And once you start messing around with it, you really start to appreciate it more. It's like anybody that's into typography, even in static print, I catch myself going to restaurants looking at the menu and just going cringing, or thinking, wow, they did a fantastic job. And my wife's like, what? Pictures? No. Font. Shakes her head.
Yeah, it's sort of a joke amongst designers that if you really like somebody, don't teach them how to identify bad fonts and bad typography, because it's a Pandora's box and you see it everywhere. Yeah. Your life will be irrevocably changed.
Start carrying a shotgun for comics.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think we probably all feel that way a little bit with some movies.
Yeah, yeah.
Once you start seeing things, you're like, oh my god.
Let's see. Okay, here's another one that I use very frequently. So let's say that we did this, I call it a typewriter, but obviously typewriters haven't been relevant for a long time. So we'll say, computer screen typing on. I guess a lot of times when I do like an explainer video for a website or something like that, there's almost always a box that needs to be filled out and then the little thing gets clicked. So obviously you just animate the opacity coming on, easy, cheesy, blah, 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 blah. But especially with a computer screen, a lot of times you want to have a little cursor at the end that might flash. Or a lot of times what I'll do, you may have noticed it some in that Royals thing, there's a lot of little things that, let's see if I can find one here. Actually, oh, I know where there's one in here.
It's like looking at the ocean, all the fish.
Yeah, I know. There's a lot going on in there. Wish I could scrub. Okay, watch right down here. See these little dots? Like something like that is a great little detail that helps keep things moving. Like that, in my mind, implies like something's processing, something's happening. There's behind the scenes stuff going on that helps, make you feel like something's going on. Same thing here too. You'll see this little text scroll, filling out. I use that trick a lot too. If you look for the Royals thing, you'll see it everywhere because it fills up space and it looks like there's a lot of calculations happening.
It's like a texture. I mean, you just
yeah. And so those little dots. You could, if you wanted to, like create some shape layers and play with the opacity and stuff, but that's stupid. It is. Just put it right here. Set your range selector to those. Oops. This is a time when that index might be really helpful, so you can get right on there. And then what you could do is just I don't have my easy keys to be precise here. Oh, the thing about index is that you can go over where the end is, so just be aware of that. So this is all that's happening there, and then what I'm generally doing then is creating that start keyframe at the end again, and then you put this easy little expression on it that you don't even have to know because it's right here. I'll loop out. And so now, Just goes like that for as long as you want it to.
Yeah, so if you drag your timeline out, you want this to go for an hour and a half.
It will go forever,
It'll
yes.
forever. So how would you solve the cursor, the underscore,
Same thing.
even while it's typing on?
Oh, it's been a while since I did one of those. I usually just do them manually.
Yeah.
It kind of tends to work better that way. But I would use the same little expression on the opacity of that.
Sure, but typically that's moving at a constant speed.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's
You
easy to
usually
do.
have to kind of adjust that. I mean, you could like have a second text layer that. It seems like it'd be more trouble than it's worth to try to work it out with text animators.
Yeah.
You could do it, I think, but yeah, I don't think it'd be worth the trouble. Okay. Kind of already did that. Did that. Okay. So I feel like we've kind of covered the basic mechanics of how all this stuff work. I want to show you a few more of my kind of regular go-to things here.
That was all super basic.
So let's maybe. Maybe, and this can, obviously all this stuff can always be combined. So maybe you want your text to animate on, and then again, it has to sit there for a while, so you want something to happen. A lot of times what I'll do is create a second copy of it, and then maybe throw on like just some blur, let's say. I'm going to set this to just vertical and crank it way up so that you get kind of these cool lines here. I'm going to do a second copy with just a little bit of soft. This would be a good time to parent things together so that if you move this around, you can't lose that other one. And I mean, that's sort of an interesting look, but it's still not doing anything. So maybe this would be a good time for one of those wiggly selectors, eh? So let's just animate the opacity and add a wiggly selector. Turn that opacity down, maybe just kind of tweak this a little bit. Correlation way down. Let's see what that does. It's considerably more interesting, isn't it? Just something that's got some life to it. And obviously you could then tweak this in a variety of ways. Let's see, maybe let's not really working the way I want it. Yeah, it's just getting weird. Oh, I think the right way to do what I was working towards there would actually be, yeah, because I'm fighting against the blur. I would instead want to use, say, a directional blur. Kind of turn it like that. And maybe just create like a quick mat here.
It was mind-blowing to anybody else the speed he works through. It's like he's which I can't do this fast. Because I don't have Google Fire.
Okay. So for those of you who didn't come along for the ride there, I just created a quick solid, and I moved it down, and I used it to create a quick alpha mat, so that this is only visible, this little shadow layer is only visible on that, within the confines of that solid that I created. So, you know, maybe if you had like a horror movie or something, this might be a nice way to give your titles a little bit of a spooky feeling or something like that. Just, you know, a way to think about, as I showed in that other example, a lot of times just creating a second copy of your text is a good way to add some complexity to it, so that you can move some stuff, or you know, keep it readable, but give it some life, give it something interesting. Amazing. Okay, so in my notes, so I'm trying to keep track of what I have talked about. Okay. Text on a path. Did you know you can put text on a path? I bet most of you did. Super useful sometimes. So it's just right here under the stuff. There's a path options, and if you don't have a path, it doesn't do anything. But now that I do, I can choose to apply it to that path. And so obviously this is sort of a weird, wonky path. But you know, there's a lot of times when just given a little bit of a curve or something like that is going to be really useful. And maybe you just want it to kind of move around something like that. You can just animate your margins here. So especially if you combine this with another text animator, maybe you could be animating this along the path here. And then separately, you know, have yourself like a little position opacity thing going on. So, and you'll note this position animator is still keeping it on that path, which is good. Just make myself a quick little. So you'll see it's moving along the path, but then also animating on at the same time. And you could have 50 different text animators going simultaneously if you wanted to deal with that kind of complexity. Just kind of as far as your imagination can go.
Yeah, I can't follow the 3 year.
Commercial for amusement park.
Can't follow the
Sure, sure. This also gets really powerful when you want to do some of the crazy non-text stuff I'm going to show you later. Yeah, we'll get there. A lot of times just, you know, kind of working around the curves of the image that it's sitting on top of or something like that, even if it's just barely off of straight, it's enough to kind of keep it, to help it integrate into the image and make it feel more cohesive, and it looks better, and people are happy.
Can you animate the path?
Yeah, you can animate the path while, just like anything else, it's just a mask. So if you wanted to animate the path while this happens, just add yourself yet another layer of complexity there. Depends on how much you can do and what you need it to do. Yep. Let's see, you can do closed paths, of course, as well. The thing about closed paths is, there's a good example right there. You need to make sure that you set that path down here to none, set that mask so that it's not, I'll show you down there, because it's going to work like a mask until you tell it not to. So if you don't want it to work like a mask, make sure you set it to none. But this works, I think, pretty much identically to the way it does in Illustrator, where you can reverse the path to put it on the outside, and you can make it go around like that. You can use the baseline offset as a good way to kind of do stuff like that. You can animate the baseline, so that could be cool too, to make things kind of pop out from a circle. Maybe use a mat of a circle and then make it pop out from behind that. I think I've done that a lot on like pie charts or something, you know. Be a good way to bring your labels in around a pie chart. Let's see. Yeah, that's as good a time as any. Okay, one of the times that you'll use text a lot is when you might have, let's see if this is all linked up to work correctly. Yeah, sweet. When you've got something like this. All right, okay, wonderful. So you've got yourself some graphs that some client sent to you of all their super boring facts that they want you to make look slightly more interesting. They probably send them to you as Illustrator files, because that kind of makes the most sense. And so you think to yourself, how can I animate all of this text that's part of this graph? Should be able to just bring it right in from Illustrator, right? Unfortunately, you can't come straight from Illustrator into After Effects with editable text right now, but there is a way that you can do it. it involves an extra step through Photoshop, but I do want to show you that since I use this a lot. I get a lot of these kind of infographic explainer type videos or whatever, and one of the best ways to make a boring graph a little more interesting, besides making the bars move up, is to do something with the text, because there's not a whole lot else you can do. So the way that you can do that, you'll, while the integration with Illustrator in After Effects in general is a lot better than it used to be, you still kind of have to set things up in a specific way to be able to do as much. So you generally have to, like if I wanted to deal with all this separately, I would want to make these blue bars their own layer in Illustrator so that I'd have separate control over them. You can import things as shape layers now, but then you kind of end up with just one shape layer with 10,000 shapes on it, and you spend so much time dissecting it in there. A lot of times it's still easier to do it in here if it's more than like 1 or 2 shapes. But as far as the text goes, you can kind of just dump all that to one layer. And then if you export to a Photoshop file, I usually keep it as high as possible. It technically doesn't matter with what we're going to do. You want to make sure it does right layers. I don't know why I'm pointing at my screen. Right here. You want to make sure it writes layers and preserve text editability. And so then you can open that in so now you can open this up in Photoshop. Sometimes you don't have to open it up in Photoshop, but I want to show you something important. Yes, I know my fonts are missing. So, my fonts are missing, but it recognizes them as fonts in here. You do need to make sure before you go into After Effects that it's in RGB versus CMYK, because After Effects will yell at you if you try to bring it to CMYK file. And a lot of times too, just for sort of ease, I'll just open these up and take them out of the group so that they're kind of right there for me to work with. And then, so let's bring this Photoshop file in. And I'm going to bring this in as a composition, open that up. And see, these are all just objects, they're just layers. But there's this sweet command up here, layer, convert to editable text. I know the font's missing, but it's a text layer now. And I can now do all the sweet animations I want to.
Yeah.
So that's the workaround if you want to bring something from Illustrator. Trying to think.
Would that ever be a problem, not since you don't have the font?
Well, I mean, it's just because the font that I built that with isn't on Nick's computer.
Oh.
I mean, yes, you would need the font if you wanted to preserve that, the integrity of that original image. And that's actually a good question because let's say that I didn't have this font and it's a really expensive font and the client's not going to provide it or anything like that. There will be times when it might be best, like, I mean, that's when I would say to the client, well, if you want this animated so badly, like, I'm not going to pay $300 for this font that I'm going to use for just your project because you wanted it to be in some whatever. So if it's that important, you can do it. But you could go through and individually, obviously this is the wrong mask shape, but you could do something like this, but then you're just animating them as layers, and you're not going to have any of that individual text control. I've certainly done that before because sometimes you just can't. No other option. But that's obviously not the preferable way to go because it severely limits what you can do in the same amount of time. Though, if you ever have a time when you would prefer to be able to prefer to be able to have a font layer broken out into individual characters or words or whatever. You know, maybe you thought you wanted to use the text animators and then you kind of changed your mind, or you're doing something, you're doing the text animators but you want to do something else crazy. There is the script that exists, which is really helpful in those situations. Is this connected to the internet? Oh, there we go. Okay. And it is called decompose text. You could just Google that, but it will bring you to this site. I don't know how much demo video is going to show necessarily, but yeah, it's kind of a demo of how it works. But it will actually break this out. You can kind of see there all the individual characters. So if that's ever useful for you, then there you go. Another great way to use text is utility stuff. I'm just going to make a new one here. Doesn't matter. Okay. Expressions. For example, if you want time code rolling over your stuff, you can just create a text layer that does that. You can do frame count, stuff like that. You can, if you know about expressions, you could create layers that would tell you what the name of the font is, if that might be relevant to you. And you can really kind of take that way out to something like this script. If this is something that you needed, this would be the biggest lifesaver ever. This is a script that allows you to create a spreadsheet that After Effects can take data from. So let's say you had a TV spot and every station you were sending it to across the country needed its own slate with the proper information on it and stuff. You might be making 100 slates. That would suck to do manually. So somebody has probably already created that spreadsheet telling you what you need to do. So instead of doing all those slates manually, you could use a script like this, and it'll plug in expressions to the text layers in After Effects, and it'll pull data from the proper spaces, and it'll make you comps with all the information that you need. So that's one thing that's really cool about After Effects, is it allows a lot of automation things, and text is has a lot of good utility uses too that you might not think about. Yeah.
Could you do multiple data elements? Like if you were creating, like I was thinking back to the Royal stuff, you know, if you needed batting average and birthday, all that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it would work exactly the same way.
Not just the one thing with the call letters of the station, but you could have 20 pieces of text.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I mean, this just, you know, they're showing a slate because that's probably the most common usage, but this will plug into whatever you want it to plug into. And I mean, you could make your own if you know how to script. It's just a matter of how, it's always the trade-off of how much you would have to do manually versus whether it's worth paying for something like this, or if you know how to script, whether it's worth writing a script to do that job.
You have more time or money?
Yeah.
Money is $50. Time is for me.
Yeah.
Years.
Okay, so I showed you that little data scroll element before. This is that. You'll notice it's a little less responsive because it's a lot of text on the screen and it's got to kind of process all of that. But this is just one of those little data scroll elements. And it's a great thing if you're ever doing something kind of techy looking. It's a great thing to just fill up space. And all it is just a bunch of lorem ipsum stuff because it looks like words. or if you want it to be a little more techy, there's like binary translators and stuff. You can just grab a couple paragraphs of something off Wikipedia, put it in the binary translator, copy paste that over to here, so you have just all ones and zeros that'll come spitting out of this thing and look all complicated stuff. Just in case you ever need some of that and you're not familiar with this website, there's a website called Lipsum, L-Ipsum, and it will generate lorem ipsum for you. And it's really handy. You need a bunch. You can tell it to generate, say, I want 15 paragraphs of lorem ipsum. And now here you go.
I heard a rumor Iron Man 3, when you see his mask, he's flying around, everything in there is relevant to what Iron Man's doing. Because it could just be this. But they went ahead and went a step further.
There's
altitude. And
yeah, there's
serious.
There's a Tumblr devoted to finding the little data readouts in sci-fi movies and showing you what they actually are.
Oh.
And like a lot of them, it's like somebody went to the Wikipedia page for HTML code or something like that and just copy paste the stuff that looked like code. And obviously most people don't know, but if you're one of those that does, you can enjoy yourself there, I'm sure. Okay, yeah, I'm kind of through a lot of the utility stuff, and I'm going to show kind of some of the section stuff. Okay, oh, here's a good one. If you ever need a number counter to just go up, this is one of those things that sounds easy, and it's harder than you think. Generally, the best way to do it is to add a slider control, which you get to from, it's an effect expression controls slider control. And then I just animated this little value from 0 up to however many, 500 I guess. Let me kill this for a second, show you what's happening. And then I just pick with the source text down to the slider. So what it's actually doing is taking that value, but it's taking a really precise version of that value, which is not necessarily what I want. I mean, you can see here, it's telling me 225, but it's 225.446, blah, 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 blah. I don't want that. I just want it rounded off. So there's a little expression that you can use to tame that. It just looks like this. It's math.round and then value with parentheses. A lot of this kind of simple expression stuff, you can usually just, if you kind of ask Google your question, it's pretty easy to find that. But right now that's rounding this off to one value. And if you wanted it in tenths or hundreds or stuff like that, you can just specify that right here. And it'll kind of help tame it to the amount you want. So making something like a clock, a digital clock, really sucks actually, because you kind of have to cap it at that value and then have it go back down. It's really easier to just kind of fake it rather than try to build it so that it works correctly, because you would have to have you end up having to have like each digit really kind of be its own text layer and then work off of the calculations of the one before so that it can work in tenths of that. Not even
Could
tenths.
you do like the stop? The stop?
Well, yes, but
just do
then it depends on how much control you want to have over the speed of it. And there's a great expression. You just write time. So right now it's just showing me the actual time of the comp.
Yeah.
But let's say I wanted that to move at I wanted that to be keyframeable, or I wanted to have that in a pre-comp and then bring it in here so I can control it differently, all this stuff. So to be able to have a fully controllable one, it's complex. But I mean, you can add offsets to something like this. Like this is the time of the comp right now plus 6,000. So that's rolling in real time. But that's basically doing like what that other expression was doing. If this is relevant to you, then you've got it right there. Again, this is something where you have to be kind of careful of how your text is aligned and stuff, because it'll sort of depends on your font. Like sometimes every time it hits a 1, everything's going to collapse in, and just got to be kind of aware of what you've got. So these aren't text animations per se, but a lot of times you might combine something like this with a text animation to make a nice complex thing. Like that bounce right there, you might have it move in and then the letters shuffle in. I just wanted to kind of show this as an example of, you know, don't think that you're necessarily limited to using those text animators. Feel free to animate them separately in addition to all the other stuff you have going on. It's just, again, it's kind of a matter of complexity, what you want to get into. Okay, so I'm about to move on to a bunch of crazy non-text uses of text. So are there any other questions about this kind of stuff before I move into those? Yeah.
When you're animating the text specifically with the range selectors, does it still obey motion blur within that comp?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you just have to enable the layer, and it'll, yeah, just like, will work just like any other movement would. Okay, so we'll try to do these in kind of ascending complexity here. So I sort of already showed you the little dots thing at the end of a word, but let's say that you have a, I use this a lot, where you might have a dashed line that you want to point to something. This is a great opportunity to use those paths. Instead of like bringing in, you know, maybe you made that path in Illustrator or something like that. Maybe, instead of trying to bring that in, just make text on a path. And fill this out. Then you just animate the opacity as it's along that path, and now it'll follow that. And so that's a total non-text use, but it's a really useful way to make something like this happen. And I don't know why you would choose to do this necessarily, but you could crunch the tracking in enough that it's a solid line and still use, if you wanted to do an animation that for some reason relied on something that's in the text animations, you could make that stroked line that utilizes things that are only available in the text animator, instead of it just being a path that uses a stroke effect or something like that. So just because the text animators work differently than anything else in the program in some ways, they can give you this new level of complexity that you might not be able to get other places, or it might be a lot harder to achieve other places. So it's just something to kind of keep in mind. I use this kind of pointer line a lot in things, and text is a little text layer of just a bunch of periods or dashes or something like that is a really good way to do it. And so once you start getting into that mindset, you kind of open yourself up to all kinds of craziness like this. See, those are all just text layers. And what I did is I made a layer of just periods, and each one has a, just a circle. It's just a circle path on it. And then I made one animator